Looks like we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jeff Hunt. I have the wonderful privilege of serving as the Vice President of Public Policy for Colorado Christian University, where I direct our think tank, the Centennial Institute. This webinar is titled Legal Considerations for Coronavirus Guidance and Church Gatherings. We're hosting a whole series of webinars to help people answer some of the many questions we're facing as a result of the coronavirus. As the spread of the coronavirus continues nationwide, many states have begun issuing guidance, and in some instances, outright bans regarding public gatherings. What does this mean for our churches? Are they bound by directives issued by government officials and agencies? And if they choose to still meet, do they face any legal consequences for doing so? To help us navigate these issues, we are honored today to hear from Teresa Sidebotham and Nicole Hunt of Telias Law. They wrote an article that was published in Church, Law, and Tax, a publication of Christianity Today, titled Legal Considerations for Coronavirus Guidance and Church Gatherings. Let me introduce our speakers to help us guide this. They're brilliant. We're very glad to have them here. Teresa Sidebotham assists organizations in the US and internationally with a special focus on employment law, religious and nonprofit law, and child safety. She advises on numerous misconduct investigations. She is also the founder of Telias Law. Teresa was mentored by judges at the Colorado Court of Appeals and worked at a large law firm serving religious institutions and doing general litigation before opening Telias Law. Nicole Hunt earned her JD from George Mason University Antonin Scalia Law School in 2011. She was admitted to the Colorado Bar in 2014. While in law school, Nicole was a legal extern with Americans United for Life and helped the organization advance life-affirming laws at the state level. Before law school, Nicole worked in Washington, D.C. as a legislative assistant to two members of Congress. And in full disclosure, as you can imagine, Nicole Hunt is my wife and really the brains of the whole Hunt operation. So we're glad to have her here with us today. But in light of that, I want to go ahead and to kind of turn it over and start asking some questions. Teresa, I'm going to kind of lean into you as we get started here. There's a lot, this is a new issue for a lot of people. I was talking to another attorney today, the General Counsel of Colorado Christian University, and he said they're going back to precedent law from the Spanish flu to try to figure out all these contracts, how it impacts all these contracts. This is a new time for us. We're all trying to figure it out. Maybe give us an insight into the legal world right now. I'm sure you have other clients dealing with this, but can you give us a little bit of a picture of what attorneys are dealing with as a result of the coronavirus?
Well, just speaking to our practice areas.
We lost Teresa's audio.
Oh.
Nicole, can you hear Teresa?
I can, yeah.
Oh, I lost Nicole's audio too. Hold on, it might be the fact I'm missing the audio. Stand by. No, you guys are both on. All right, try again. Can I hear you, Teresa?
Can you hear me? I can hear Nicole.
All right, I got you now. Okay, we're good. All right, Teresa,
Good.
Go ahead. I'll let you answer the question.
Well, speaking to the areas of practice where Nicole and I work, there's enormous concern for all employers really about, how do you handle this, keep the business going? How do you treat your employees fairly? Specifically for churches and ministries, which is a big focus for us. We're getting lots of questions about, which laws apply to us. How do we continue serving? In the case of a Catholic client, it's, how do you administer sacraments to the faithful while still complying with the law? There's just a lot of questions. And of course, the church is really here to serve the community. So they want to know how to do that well.
One of the issues that they brought up in your article was this notion of police powers. We are not in January or early February anymore. Life isn't just going on normally. And really, it seems like the foundation of your argument in this article that you wrote for Church, Law, and Tax was that this is a different time. And we have to look at this as a different time because of police powers. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, sure. The idea of police power is intended to be for emergencies. So yes, we are in a different time if that's a rather short time. So for instance, if we think of former Soviet Russia, they permanently put restrictions on churches because they didn't think it accorded with their policies. Well, you can't do that here constitutionally. But for a brief period of time, in order to keep society safe, in order to protect people, the governor, the president can put in place restrictions that apply to everyone and all organizations. They can't especially pick on religious organizations, but if they're treating organizations equally, they can also put some restrictions on religious organizations.
And Nicole, you mentioned in the article, I know you helped co-write this with Teresa, that it is a combination of state constitutional and statutory power. So this has existed for a while. This has been on the books. And then when an emergency happens, whether it's a hurricane or in this case, a virus, they can implement this. So we really shouldn't be shocked by the fact that this power exists, but talk about how it's a combination of both constitutional power and statutory power.
That's right. So for example, here in Colorado, if you look to the governor's executive order where he declared a state of emergency and then cited to the authority that he has now because of this emergency, he cites first to the Constitution, the Colorado Constitution, which gives him executive authority over certain aspects of the law. And then he cites to statutes, to Colorado statutes that say explicitly what kind of powers he has.
So this power has been implemented. The governor launched this he declared a state of emergency on, I think it was March 10th, and that gave him the power to start to implement these rules. I see we're having a little bit of internet technology challenges, but bear with us. Hopefully we can get through it. So he implements this, and he says initially that there's guidance out there, and that's different than a straight out ban. Can you talk, either Teresa or Nicole, about the difference between guidance and a ban when it comes to whether or not churches can meet? Because that's a big difference.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to guidance, the big difference is that guidance does not carry with it the force of the law behind it. Guidance, you have the authorities and power recommending certain steps be taken so that you can avoid further dramatic emergency type situations. However, when the authority issues a ban, it carries with it the threat of legal force. In this case, and in many cases around the states, where right now it's mostly recommendations, there won't be legal enforcement unless the governor or the mayor of that particular area decide to issue a full-on ban. Now, if there is a ban, then certain things can take place. For instance, in some states, there have been threats that if organizations continue to hold events or gatherings, that the National Guard will be sent, the state National Guard will be sent to break up those gatherings. In our article, we write about how court orders can also be issued. And depending on what's in the court order, you could see a variety of things. You could see state benefits withheld from churches. You could see forced closures. You could also see jail time. It would depend on what exactly is held in that court order. But primarily, the major difference is that on the one hand, you have the possibility of legal enforcement with a ban, and with recommendations, guidelines, they are being recommended so that the crisis will be further averted.
And just to add to that, if a religious organization, for instance, decides to go against a ban or even a recommendation, there's some possibility there for civil liability too, because you might be acting negligently. So if you acted in a certain way and somebody were to be injured or die, who knows whether a jury might find you responsible for that and civil liability. So that's another piece to think about.
Yeah, it's very important to think about, especially if you're a church on a very limited budget. You don't have the ability to play around with potential lawsuits like that. Now, these rules that the government has put down are not totally unlimited. And you kind of mentioned this in your article. You lay out 3 reasons that the government is restricted when it comes to assembling, limits they can place on people assembling. One is that the restrictions have to be reasonable. Number 2, that they're not content-based. And number 3, that they're narrowly tailored. Now, I'm not an attorney, I'm just married to one, but I can tell you we could spend an entire article on just those words alone. Talk about reasonable first, not content-based, and then narrowly tailored. Can you go through those?
Sure. That's from one of the First Amendment standards about, when the government can tell people that they can't meet together or put limitations on it. So reasonable means it has to fit the situation. And if a lot of people are dying of some kind of epidemic, reasonable looks different from, just an ordinary Saturday in June. And golly, I'm blanking now. So first it has to be reasonable, and then it has to be
not content-based.
Yeah, so the government can't disfavor certain types of speech. It can't say it's okay to have speech about some things, but not other things. And this is where you get into whether you're picking on religious organizations particularly. So you can't shut down just religious organizations and not similar types of gatherings.
One area where we may see a debate on that, and I've kind of seen it pop up a little bit online, is the notion that some governors are saying, well, Planned Parenthood is an essential organization, churches are not. And I think we're going to see, if that continues to go that direction, you're going to see a lot of debate, because it's going to seem like it's content-based then. If more liberal governors are saying, well, I'm willing to stand and keep Planned Parenthood open, and abortion is an essential service, but a church is not an essential service, that then seems like it might become content-based. Whereas, if it's generally applicable, then it would be not content-based. And so I think governors and mayors need to be very careful about making sure that they don't fall into that trap of picking winners or losers based upon content. Is that right, Teresa?
Well, it absolutely is, because that's what a huge amount of the First Amendment litigation is going to be around. And what you're saying here is the government really has to narrowly tailor it to meet legitimate concerns like public safety and restrict constitutional rights as little as possible. So the comparison with Planned Parenthood, for instance, might be to other types of medical clinics and non-emergency procedures. So if they're shutting down the foot surgery clinics, perhaps they need to be shutting down Planned Parenthood as well, or conversely not. If no medical clinics are shut down, then it might be content-based just to shut down Planned Parenthood. But they do have to be careful not to let whatever their own personal bias on what has value, well, I'm going to pick this, but not that, because I don't think it has value.
So then tell me what narrowly tailored means. That seems like a vague term that only attorneys could parse. So the law has to be narrowly tailored. Go ahead.
Well, it means that you can't put in place a regulation that's as broad as it could be. So, for instance, if you say you're not going to have any religious services in the state of Colorado, that would not be narrowly tailored. But if you said there's all of these possible ways that you can have religious services that might still meet the safety concerns, we're only going to tell you, for example, that you can't have more than 50 people get together in the room, or more than 10 people, or, whatever's currently being applied to everyone else. And I think we have seen concerns to make it narrowly tailored. So you don't stop ministers from going to people's homes to visit the elderly or visiting the sick or giving people the sacrament or, some of the things that religious people do. And you try to figure out, okay, how can we make the core functions happen without shutting it down more than we absolutely have to around public safety?
Right.
So that might be what narrowly tailored looks like in this situation. In every single free speech dispute, it could look different.
Great. Nicole, do you want to add anything to the definition of narrowly tailored?
No, I think that's right on. I think another example is that churches are not being told by the state governments or mayors that they can't continue to live stream or do some other form of ministry. And I think those would be examples where it's not been narrowly tailored. So those are just some more examples where I feel like they have been pretty targeted at the specific issue here, which is the contact person, face-to-face contact.
So what's important for people to hear through all this is that while the government is placing limits on size of gatherings and saying you can't have a church service with 500, 50, 10, 1,000, 2,000 people, it doesn't necessarily mean that the government is trying to stop all the activities of the church. Instead, they're saying, but by it being narrowly tailored, they're saying we're really mostly concerned about the size of the gathering. But when it comes to other things, whether it's webinars, visiting people one-on-one, if pastors do that oftentimes, hear confession. I saw a great picture of a priest hearing confession. He was 6 feet away in a parking lot, but he was still, people were driving up to have confession. All that stuff that churches typically do can still be done, but the government's trying to narrowly tailor their restrictions in an effort to protect the health of the people. And they're doing this under emergency powers that they've been granted both constitutionally and statutorily. So this isn't something that was just sprung upon us. This wasn't something that just popped up in an emergency and they're making it up as they go. This was been laid out in law. They're trying to do it in a narrowly tailored way. And they still want churches to be operating and doing many of the things that churches do well. They just need to make sure that they're doing their best not to hold gatherings of where people can get this infection of 10, 50, 1,000 people. Is that right? Does that sound like a good analysis?
That is. And if I could add a practical tip to that, and I hear from other attorneys around the country in the same area of law. And what I'm hearing is that if as a church you have different ministries that you're not sure about, going back to the government entity can be really helpful to say, hey, can we continue to feed these poor people? Can we continue to do this community service and either get some kind of exemption or get some kind of guidance on, what they would consider to be a narrowly tailored way to keep doing ministry. It's not really in the interest of the government to shut down the church's charitable work, because the government needs the church in this crisis to take care of people, to help people, to encourage people. And so I think that interaction can be a good approach.
I do want to pause just in our questions here, let you know that you can ask questions in the Zoom group chat or on YouTube, and I'll be sure to relay that to Teresa and Nicole so that they can answer. So if you have questions, please let us know. I noticed the mayor just today, Mayor of Denver, came out with a ban on basically all activities, a shelter in place, a stay-at-home order. And he did list churches as an essential business where people and pastors can still travel and do their work. But one thing I noticed in your article that I think is really important on page 2 there, and this is really key to all of this, if your state, and I kind of underlined if your state and even city, we're not seeing national, federal shutdown orders. A lot of these decisions are being made state by state, mayor by mayor, city by city. Why is it important for people to look at that as opposed to maybe the national level? They may not see anything coming from the federal government, but their state may be reacting differently. Why do they need to look at that? Why is that important?
Yeah, that is really important. And what Americans need to remember is that we're a system of federalism. So we have national government at the very top, we have the state level next, and then we have local government. And, here in Colorado, we haven't had very many mayors decide to make particular decisions regarding the residents of their specific city till just today with the Denver mayor doing that. For the most part, all of our direction and guidance has come from Governor Polis. But ultimately, we think we've seen this play out in San Francisco. We've got a San Francisco specific orders for that area versus the entire state of California. So it is really important for all churches, all businesses, all people to be paying attention specifically to what your state restrictions are, if there are any different and more extensive local restrictions. And I think what we're going to end up seeing, at least from President Trump at this point, is that he's going to try to approach this with more of a hands-off approach and leaving some of that authority to the states, where a ban for, New York City might be appropriate, a shelter in place, that might not be appropriate for the state of Idaho, where there might be fewer cases and people that live further apart. So all of the US is geographically different, as are all of our cities, which is why it's very important for all of us to be listening to the people that are leaders in our regions and also in our state.
Let's talk a little bit about legal consequences here. I was on the phone with an attorney earlier this week, a separate attorney, and one of the things that I like about attorneys is that they'll sometimes give it to you very straight. The government has a tremendous amount of power in a state of emergency. And if you disobey a ban, there's a lot of consequences that can happen, even to the point where you may even face some jail time. And this coronavirus issue may be over before this is all litigated out and you still have to go to court and deal with all this stuff. You gave a kind of sober analysis in your article that this can be very tough on churches if they choose to disobey it. Give folks a really honest assessment of what can happen if you disobey maybe a guidance, what would happen if you disobey a ban, and what recourses does the state have to hold you accountable to this?
Well, as Nicole was explaining earlier, the guidance is more of a strong suggestion. So it doesn't really have teeth in it from the perspective of the government that gave the guidance. Where I see the bigger risk there is, are you being negligent if you ignore the guidance? And, I mentioned civil liability, but maybe more than that, do you have people's deaths on your conscience, which in some ways would be worse? So I think as good citizens, we want to listen carefully to the guidance and not go against it unless we have a very good reason to do it. The bans, on the other hand, there can be a lot of consequences, and I think Nicole hit most of them. The court order, possible fines, forcing you to shut down, bringing the National Guard out to shut you down. There's various state benefits that many organizations have, such as property tax exemptions, and there's other types of tax exemptions as well. Do you lose some of those if you disobey some kind of ban? I don't know, but you really would want to work it out very carefully with your legal counsel, exactly what you're planning to do and why and how it's banned, and what the governor and mayor may have said about that. If it becomes a criminal issue, then you're right, it's possibly jail time. And if it's an issue where others feel that a lot of people were hurt or died because of unwise actions, the public feeling could really be against you on that. If you think about the people who started the Colorado wildfires, you can get an idea of how people might feel about someone who spreads coronavirus to 2,000 people.
That's right. And I think some of the things, another thing that we didn't mention, but we wrote about in our article, were financial penalties is another option that the state could use to force churches or other businesses to follow mandates that are coming directly from the government. To give you one example, this last week I know of a church that was planning on permitting small groups of people to gather on Sunday, and they were contacted by the county leaders and asked that even though it was permitted to have at least groups of 10 or less, if they would reconsider that and instead do their live streaming option and their outside option for drive up church. And in order to comply with the local authorities, that church decided to go ahead and forego the smaller group gatherings at the church. So that's just another example. Right now we have, guidelines, which are strong recommendations. And in that instance, the church decided to follow the direction that they were asked to go in by county leaders.
All right, so I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this and take the other side. In a moment of crisis like this, people need churches more than ever. They need to connect with folks. They need spiritual teaching. They need a community by which they can connect with people. And the web and the internet is not good enough. You really need to be in a place of community where you can connect with people and live in that way and have that type of connection. Does the government have the right to stop me from being able to get together in a religious community? My orders and my directions come first from God and not from the governor or from the president or from the mayor. And God tells me to worship in community. I'm going to worship in community. What say you?
Now you're in the realm of civil disobedience, which is a really interesting area with a lot of ethical and moral implications. And the fundamental principle of civil disobedience is you do what you think God wants you to do, and you take the consequences. And so in this case, and in many cases for civil disobedience, the consequence might be jail time. We hear stories coming out of other countries where witnessing to other people might get you jail time. So I think the person has to evaluate, what is God calling me to do? What does that look like? What is the place for it? Does it really violate the rights? So for instance, if it wasn't narrowly tailored and the edict was that a priest can no longer give communion, which is an important sacrament in his church, yes, he's probably going to violate that. And ultimately, the government is likely to lose the ensuing litigation because that's really going to a core right, and it's an extremely tight restriction on the religious practice. If someone feels like they need to meet with 500 people together, no, that's a tougher call to argue that you cannot meet people's spiritual needs without that kind of large gathering. I mean, my husband was in a Bible study the other night, and they did it over Zoom, and they seemed to be having an amazing time together. So, let's not limit human creativity either.
That's right. And that's a good segue really into the kind of final parts of your article, where the churches need to be creative. They still have their mandate to serve. Teresa, you have a very impressive background living in hostile places where your family was sharing the gospel. You grew up in sharing the gospel in those areas. Talk a little bit about how you all closed the article that the gospel is still real, is still present. There's still that mandate upon us to share the good news of Jesus Christ, but we need to be creative about how we do that.
And I completely agree. There's the mandate, especially in a time of panic, because what we have to offer the world is we have a God who's in control, regardless of how long or short our lives are. We belong to him, and we can live in peace, we can show love, and we don't just give up and stop doing that. But there's a lot of great ways, a lot of creative ways that people have done it, from special types of visitation. Nicole mentioned the drive-by services, maybe having part of the service online and part of it where people come in to take the sacrament. Different ways of offering communion that don't involve sharing germs with a common cup, perhaps, maybe not as exciting, but still. Replacing the full choir with quartets because you'll get, potentially less infection there. And Nicole, I know you've been doing a lot of research on these different things, so I'd love for you to chime in too.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've touched on a lot of them. I think the big thing is just to remember, I mean, let's be honest, looking at social media, I don't think I've seen so many churches and their live streaming shared on social media ever. Like I had my fill of options available on social media this last Sunday when I opened it up to see, okay, which church service would I like to listen to? Which one of my friends' church services do I want to watch? Like I think I'm thinking about it, like the job of the church is to share the good news, to share hope. And gosh, if live streaming isn't one of the best ways to do it, I don't know what is, because it's reaching far beyond the four walls of a pastor's church. It's reaching out into the global universe. And people all around the world are hearing good news. And I think that the live streaming is a really wonderful option. But really, the sky's the limit, however creative churches can be and how they want to go about it. I've heard, in children's groups or youth groups where, their time together is being canceled. The groups of kids are still meeting together with their small group leaders via Zoom and having times to connect, having times to have worship together. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ways that the church can really make it something special and unique. And you think about the time is so limited and our resources are so limited and we have so much, time to give, that these are the best times to really invest in relationships because everyone has a lot of extra time on their hands.
Great. Go ahead, Teresa.
And I think another important thing we can show to people is kindness. We're isolated from a lot of people. We're stuck with some other people, perhaps. And whichever way, a lot of people are very anxious and they're struggling. So there are ways to show kindness, as simple as a text, maybe a gift or a grocery store pickup for somebody who's struggling, helping each other get through. And I think that's a huge part of our testimony that doesn't require us to, all go to worship service on Sunday to do it.
Well, thank you for that. I do want to close just in a second on employment law. I want to get a preview from, I think, a new article that you two are working on regarding that. But I want to kind of sum up for everyone where I think we are. And I'm going to have two attorneys. I'm going to get free legal time here, so correct me if I'm wrong. There are existing laws on the books and within our Constitution that give the state tremendous power during an emergency. That shouldn't be a shock to us. They can implement that, and they have implemented that. If we don't like it, when we're through this, we have a legislative process to change it. And if there are aspects that we don't like, we should go change it. We're going to be learning through all this. But these powers exist. Now, the government can inflict restrictions upon us in light of this. And this is where I think we can be very valuable in working with our elected officials and, even more importantly, keeping an eye on them, that the laws that they choose to implement must be 1, reasonable, 2, non-content based, and 3, narrowly tailored. If they are not, we have a duty to talk about it, raise it. So if you see an elected official that's particularly targeting churches, particularly targeting faith-based communities and saying, well, we're going to keep everything open but them, or if they're not narrowly tailored in their sense they're going to say, well, we need to shut down everything that a church does. You can't even live stream. And if it's content-based, we don't like what you're preaching about, so we're going to shut you down. Those would be a violation of reasonable, non-content-based and narrowly tailored, and we have a duty to hold those elected officials accountable. On the church's side, we have a responsibility to, 1, obey those that are in positions of leadership. There's lots of scripture about that. These laws, we don't live under a time of Caesar. Laws are written by the people and for the people, of the people. And so we have produced these laws. If we don't like them, we can change them, but we've got to make sure that we're not willfully disobeying the laws, because there could be not only criminal liability, there can be civil liability. If someone dies, we could face negligent lawsuits. So there's a lot to take into this consideration. Now, if there's a moment where we need to engage in civil disobedience, believe me, I'll be one of the first there with you, but we need to accept the consequences if we're engaging in civil disobedience and recognize that we could have both civil and criminal consequences laid upon us. Is that a good summary of where we currently are in this state? Oh, and then I will add that all these are different based upon your city and your state. So you really need to know who is putting these forward in your state and in your community, and then make sure that you're paying attention to each one of those, because what's happening in California is not quite happening in Colorado yet. It could, but it's going to be different in places like Idaho. So did I sum it up okay? Did I miss anything, Teresa, Nicole?
I think what I would add is just, if you are thinking civil disobedience as a church or even as an individual, that I would recommend that you contact legal counsel before you follow through on those beliefs and thoughts, just to make sure that you understand what the legal consequences might be.
I thought for a second you were going to say, talk to your wife before you do anything that involves civil disobedience.
Yeah,
In your case, Jeff, yes.
But for anyone else out there, make sure you talk to an attorney first, just to make sure you know what you're doing.
Yeah, and there are a lot of great Christian attorneys out there. Teresa, I know you're very involved with the Christian Legal Society. Do you mind sharing maybe a minute about the Christian Legal Society?
It's a fellowship gathering of attorneys right now, not meeting in person, but attorneys who are both living for the kingdom and engaged in the practice of law. And yeah, that's a great resource to find the right type of legal counsel for whatever issue you might be dealing with. They practice all different types of practice areas. So the fellowship.
Great. All right. So you've written an article that was very popular, not only on your website, but went viral and published through Christianity Today channels. I know you're working on a new one. A lot of people are going to be answering, especially if you're an employer, questions about employment law. I don't know if you can give us a sneak peek. I know it hasn't been fully formed quite yet, but maybe give us a preview of some of the issues that employers need to be thinking about with regards to coronavirus.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for asking. We've got, that is a separate area of the law that we practice at the firm. And some of the areas that we're highlighting for businesses during this pandemic is some policies they need to start thinking about, potentially reviewing. One that we talk about in an upcoming article is related to infectious disease policy. Does your business have that kind of a policy? The kinds of things you might be answering in this policy, is should employers quarantine employees if they are sick? Is there a responsibility for the employee to, let the employer know if they are sick or if they've been diagnosed, and what kind of steps need to be taken at the workplace in such a case? So these are all things that could be laid out in a policy that already existed before a situation like this came to be. But if it doesn't, these are policies that business people should think about, and religious organizations should think about creating. Some updates to policies that employers may be interested in, spending this time now to review is, what is your leave policy? What is your travel policy look like? If there is some kind of a pandemic like this, what is the response plan of your organization? As the Congress and the Senate are hammering out some specific details of an aid package that's going to be coming out to employees and employers, another thing that we'll be looking at is, what is the new Family Medical Leave Act changes? What kind of benefits are there? How does it potentially impact the employer? What are the choices the employer should be making as they're looking at, not having income coming in, but still needing to, have employees that you'd like to have working for you in the next, 4, 6, 9 months, depending on how long this takes. What are the options that employers have? And especially for, religious organizations, like we want to be able to act in, or any religious leader, wanting to be able to act in a moral way where you can show appreciation to your employee, but also have to realize that there's a bottom line at the end of the day, and the business can only afford to go so long or pay so many employees for so long. So these are some of the issues we're going to be touching on as a firm, trying to give some guidance to not just business leaders, but also ministry leaders and others who are trying to figure out how to make all this work in the new world that we're in right now.
Great. Go ahead, Teresa.
I just said that was very well put. And, as we run a business ourselves, so our heart is to help people get the information they need to make good decisions and work through all these problems in Christ-honoring ways.
Great. We do have a question. Roger, great to see you. Thanks so much for being on. Roger is one of my favorite people in the whole world. So Roger, just for asking a question, I'm going to give you a great shout out. He asked, what is the difference for an order? We talked about guidelines and bans. Well, what about an order? Mayor Hancock issued a stay-at-home order. To me, I'll let the lawyers answer.
Nicole, I'll let you get that one.
Yeah. So an order would be similar to like a direct ban. Like it is a direct directive from the state. They're telling you what to do. So in this case, I think that you should treat an order like you would treat a ban, which means that it would carry with it the same type of legal consequences that a ban or a restriction would carry.
So it needs to be. It needs to be taken very seriously. I mean, there are going to be consequences. We've got to go through and look and see exactly what the consequences are. But if you disobey this order from the mayor, you will face some type of consequences that they could implement. Now, the follow-up question is, what kind of police force do they have to put into this type of order? I think we saw over the weekend, tons of people out in California beaches. It takes time for people to learn all this stuff, but it should be taken very seriously. Joel asked the question, I wonder if other cities will follow suit. I think so. I will tell you that there's a lot of discussion among policymakers that the best thing to do when going through hell is to go through it quickly and just buckle down and shut everything down. And if we can do that, then we can get out on the other side. On the flip side, what I appreciate, I just heard the president's conversation just before we started this. He said, we can't let the cure be worse than the actual disease. And I appreciate that they're looking at those challenges. We are driving ourselves into an economic disaster. And we've got to be careful that the cure isn't worse than the actual disease itself. But I would, Joel, I would absolutely believe not only other cities, but other states. And I don't know where Governor Polis is on this specifically, but I'm anticipating he's going to move that direction that Mayor Hancock went, that we're going to see a full order lockdown, not only in the city of Denver, which just happened today, but in surrounding cities and maybe even possibly the state. So get ready, it's possibly coming. Well, Teresa and Nicole, any final statements here?
My last word would just be to all religious leaders who are on the call, especially who are thinking about how this impacts the church, just not to lead with any fear, to know that the Lord creates opportunities in all circumstances for his word to be heard. And that, if they do have specific questions about their local authorities or state, that they could reach out to an attorney. They could find an attorney who specializes in this kind of area of the law through Christian Legal Society, and use them as a resource to before they make any decisions that could negatively impact their organization, to reach out to an attorney. But just to remember that this is an opportunity to share God's hope with people, and that they themselves shouldn't be afraid during this time.
Absolutely.
Teresa, any final word from you?
I think for me, the word through this time has been really refocusing me on my union with God, and making our hearts an altar to worship God. God's really got this. And I know we get scared. I do sometimes. I get anxious. But then I remember, I belong to him. I have union with him. None of this is a surprise to him. And so that encourages me. And I think we can, as Nicole said, keep offering that hope to other people.
Wonderful. Teresa, where can they learn more about Telios Law?
The website's the easiest way. They can ask you for your wife's phone number. But if you go to telioslaw.com, we actually have a ton of resources there, both for ministries and businesses, and it's easy to contact us.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. As we close here, I do want to encourage you, if you're at home and you've always wanted to get that degree, Colorado Christian University's online program is strong. That's why we've been able to absorb some of these challenges. We were early in on the online study programs, and we have over 7,000 students across the world that are getting degrees from Colorado Christian University. Over 88% of students qualify for financial aid. Over 80 academic programs that you can choose from. Average class size is only 11 people. So if you're at home with your kids and you've always wanted to get that advancement in your career, Colorado Christian University is a wonderful place to do that. And I hope you'll check it out. Go to ccu.edu. Until then, we'll keep hosting these webinars, but thank you so much for joining us. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.